theology only came from one place, the Old Testament. So if Paul's talking about the temple in Ephesians chapter 2, and Paul says that the temple is built upon the foundation of Jesus and the apostles, in other words, living human beings, then the temple itself is not a physical building. You see how these 3 points segue all together. They combine together to point to us to how to properly interpret Old Testament prophecies. Point number 4, and I'm going to have to hurry. The New Testament writers tell us that Israel and her world were typological. That is, she was a shadow of better things to come. Colossians chapter 2, Paul says, "Let no man judge you in respect of new moons, Sabbaths, the new moons and the feast days, which are," when he wrote, "a shadow of good things that are about to come." See, Israel's entire cultic world, her world of worship and sacrifice and temple and priesthood, was typological. That meant it was a physical reality that pointed to something greater, spiritual. I'm not going to dwell on that since I've already touched on it. Point number 5. The New Testament writers tell us that what the Old Testament prophets predicted, that the Old Testament prophets, remember, said that they did not understand either the manner or the time of its fulfillment, but the New Testament writers tell us, guess what? The time had arrived for fulfillment. In Matthew 13, verse 17, Jesus said, "Many prophets and wise men have desired to see the things that you see, and to hear the things that you hear, and have not." Well, isn't that exactly what Peter said? The prophets inquired and searched diligently to understand the manner and the time of the things that they predicted, but they didn't understand all that they knew, that it was not for their day, but for Peter's day. So here's Jesus saying exactly the same thing. Jesus said the prophets and the wise men longed to see it, but they didn't. But you, Jesus said, you in his time, is his generation, was seeing those things fulfilled. Go back to Acts chapter 3, a passage we noted a few moments ago. What did Peter say? Speaking of Jesus, whom the heavens must receive until the restoration of all things, spoken by all of the prophets from Moses forward. Yea, all of the prophets since the foundation of the world have spoken of these days. And by the way, a passage that I absolutely love. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11. I really believe that we've missed a whole lot of the point of this verse. Paul spoke of things that happened under the Old Testament. He gives 3 examples of events from Israel's history. And he says, and the King James renders it like this, "These things were examples for us, upon whom the ends of the world have come." That's a wrong translation. Do you know what the literal is? They were types of us. Paul is emphatically saying that those events in Israel's history were typological. They were shadows. They were veiled events. That is, the significance and meaning of those events was veiled, but now Paul is pointing out the meaning and significance. Oh, but that's not all. You know what else he says? Upon us, upon whom the ends. Now the word end there is from the Greek word telos. Telos can mean end, as in termination, the way that we would pardon me, use the word end. But it also means something greater than that. It means goal. Okay? Now watch what Paul says. Us, that's his generation, upon whom the goal of the previous ages has come. Now the word has come is from a Greek word, katantao. And it means arrived, destination reached. Okay? Do you catch the power of what Paul's saying? Paul is saying that the goal of all of the previous ages had arrived. Now, if the church was not predicted anywhere in the Old Testament, Paul shouldn't have said that, should he? In fact, he couldn't say it. If the church was not predicted in the previous ages, then Paul should have said, well, here we are struggling along in this church, this mystery church that never was predicted and that Jesus had to establish because he couldn't get around to doing the kingdom because the Jews didn't believe him. But we're looking for the goal of the ages to come one of these days. No, no, no. Paul said the goal of all of the previous ages has come upon us. They were living on the very cusp, on the very edge of the consummation of everything that had ever been predicted. Okay. So this point right here, and what this means is, whereas the Old Testament prophets were told that fulfillment was not for their day, Daniel sealed up the words of this prophecy. For it shall be for many days to come. It is for the time of the end. What did John say as he reiterates the prophecies of Daniel in the book of Revelation? John was told, do not seal the words of the vision of this book, for the time is at hand. You see the contrast, the temporal contrast? So whereas the New Testament writers tell us that the time had arrived for fulfillment, the Old Testament writers were emphatically told it was not for their day. We must honor this temporal contrast. So, when, for instance, Paul in the book of Romans says, as it was then, or this is the way it was then, pardon me, under the Old Testament. They didn't have this then. Then they were looking forward. But there's a key word in the book of Romans that is really, to some extent, amazingly enough, ignored. And it's the little Greek word nun. N-U-N is the way we would spell that. And it's translated now. Then versus now. That fifth point, folks, is really, really critical. Okay, point number 6. The New Testament writers tell us that the Old Testament prophecies, for instance, of the restoration of the temple, the restoration of Israel, the building of the temple, the establishment of the kingdom, the coming of salvation, etc., etc., were being fulfilled in Christ and the church. Okay, I must hurry. We've already gone over these points, so I'll go on. But I did want to catch this particular verse. I started to quote it a while ago, but let me just reiterate how important this is. Paul says, Romans 16:25, now to him who is able to establish you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery, which was kept secret since the world began, but is now made manifest. You see, then versus now, right? Kept secret, but now revealed. And by the prophetic commandment of the everlasting God for obedience to the faith, made known for the obedience of faith, of the faith. Now I want you to ask yourself this question. I have asked any number of dispensationalists this, both in public debate and in private conversation. When they would tell me the church and the church age was not predicted anywhere in the Old Testament. In other words, the gospel and the gospel age was not foretold anywhere in the Old Testament. Well, Paul said that he preached what he preached, the gospel, the mystery. Paul said he preached it from the Old Testament prophets. So if the church and if the gospel is not in the Old Testament prophets, how could Paul preach the gospel? How could he preach the church from the Old Testament prophets if it's not in the Old Testament prophets? Wouldn't that mean that Paul's distorting, perverting, and misusing the Old Testament prophets? Do we really want to accuse Paul of misusing the Old Testament prophets? No. Paul said it was there. It was not understood, but it's now being made manifest through his apostolic ministry. Okay. To very quickly move on. To say that Israel is the key to the understanding of the story of redemption strikes at the very heart of theologies based on the rejection and the replacement of Israel. I've already mentioned to you the amillennial view, that Israel was cut off at the cross. Well, guess what? The postmillennial view agrees with that to a great extent, although they still hold out at some point of time in the future the conversion of Israel just immediately before the Lord at the second coming. But let me reiterate this, that mistaken concepts about Israel and eschatology lie at the root of most, if not all, of the current futurist views of the end times, of eschatology. And a wrong view of Israel leads to a wrong view, therefore, of theology, of Israel, and politics, and foreign policy. Dispensationalism recognizes Israel's centrality but denies the temporal framework, that is, when her promises were to be fulfilled, and the nature of fulfillment. Postmillennialists, just like dispensationalism, has a future place for Israel, but they ignore the temporal framework, the time of fulfillment, as well as the nature of fulfillment. Because again, the postmillennialists, just like the dispensationalists, believe that the majority of national Israel will one day be converted and turn to the Lord immediately before the second coming. Amillennialism is worse than both of those. And I say that as a man who was raised in that paradigm, because it fails to understand, as a matter of fact, it just flatly rejects Israel's place in the scheme of redemption. Now, here are the prophecies that I'm going to develop in this series. Not in this series here, but in this ongoing series. Deuteronomy 32, Joel 2, along with Isaiah 32, Isaiah chapters 2 through 4, which, by the way, will be our lesson for tomorrow night. We're going to be examining Isaiah chapters 2 through 4. Isaiah chapters 49 and 61, and the prediction of the restoration of Israel in the day of salvation. Isaiah 55 and Jeremiah 31, the promise of the coming of the new covenant. Ezekiel chapter 37, one of the most critical Old Testament prophecies of the restoration of Israel, and we will examine this prophecy either Sunday morning or Sunday night. Hadn't made up my mind yet. Hosea chapter 1, verse 19, in which God, after divorcing Israel, said, "Where it was said of you, you are not my people, it will be said, you are the people of the living God. I will betroth you to me in righteousness in the last days." Zechariah chapters 9 through 14 spoke of the day of the Lord. Be a day of the Lord known only to the Lord. Now, let me just say in closing, if I can prove, and the number here is wrong because, like I said, I was still working on this up until last night and even today after I got here. It is undeniable that if I can demonstrate that any of these prophecies have been fulfilled in Christ and the church, then since the prophecies, the three prophecies that I'm going to share with you, are some of the most critical, foundational, restoration, messianic, eschatological prophecies. If I can prove they've been fulfilled, guess what? Dispensationalism falls, futurism falls, and it will demonstrate that you and I are living in the presence of God today in His kingdom. So, we have established that all New Testament eschatology is based on God's Old Testament promises to Israel. We have established the central place, therefore, of Israel in the place of eschatology. Paul said, I don't preach anything except God's promises to Israel. We have established what the New Testament writers said about their right to give the divine interpretation of Old Testament prophecies. So as we proceed, what we're going to do is we're going to call on both Old Testament prophets and New Testament prophets to help us understand some of these most critical of the Old Testament prophecies of the end time schema. And I want to tell you something. I've shared a little bit of this material in a couple of different places before, and every time I have, people have gone, wow, I'd never seen that before. But the New Testament statements about the fulfillment of these prophecies, the ones I'm going to share with you, are so clear, so emphatic, that they're undeniable. And I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you very much.